In the summer of 2022, on the third platform of the Pakapampa Archaeological Complex, at 2,140 meters above sea level in the northern Peruvian highlands, archaeologist Yuji Seiki stood before a large flat stone that had appeared at a depth of 80 centimeters during routine excavation. He had spent 17 years at this site. He knew what the presence of a sealed stone usually meant. Before the team moved it, Seiki and his Peruvian co-director Daniel Morales Chocano made a formal vow, spoken aloud, in front of the stone, asking permission from whoever lay beneath to open the tomb and study what was inside. It was not a protocol required by any institution. It was a choice the team had made, a recognition that what they were about to do had weight. What they found when the stone was lifted had never been reported before in the entire archaeological record of the Andes. At the very bottom of the shallow pit, 1 meter in diameter, 30 centimeters deep, lay 20 Strombus shells, each one coated in red pigment, almost certainly cinnabar. The shells were not from Peru. Strombus gigas does not live in Peruvian waters. It lives off the coast of Ecuador, roughly 500 kilometers to the north. Each one of those shells had to be carried across mountain passes, traded through at least one intermediate network, and brought to a highland ceremonial complex at an altitude where the air is thin and the journey long. The individual placed on top of them, a man between 25 and 35 years old, had been laid on this bed of imported shells as though the shells themselves were the ground he deserved to rest on. Alongside him were square beads made from white shell, blue-green stones, and objects the team would spend months documenting. His head had been sprinkled with red pigment. The entire arrangement was unlike anything excavated before at this latitude, in this period, in this cultural tradition. The Pakapampa Archaeological Project began in 2005 as a joint effort between the National Museum of Ethnology in Osaka, Japan, and Peru's National University of San Marcos. Its founding question was deceptively simple. When, exactly, did social hierarchy begin in the northern Peruvian highlands? Not inequality in a general sense. Not the presence of leaders versus followers, but the specific, documentable moment when a society began organizing itself around the idea that certain individuals, from birth, or by selection, or by some mechanism not yet understood, occupied a fundamentally different position from everyone else. The question had been asked before, and for most of the 20th century, the standard answer pointed to Chavín de Huántar, the famous ceremonial center in the Ancash Highlands, with its U-shaped platforms, its carved tenon heads, its galleries, and sunken plazas. Chavín de Huántar was the anchor of Andean religious and political power in the first millennium BCE. Everything converged there. Pakapampa, 70 kilometers to the north, was considered a secondary site, important, but derivative. A place that participated in the Chavín network rather than originating its own. That assumption held for decades. Then the tombs started appearing. The Pakapampa Archaeological Complex occupies a series of terraced platforms on the slopes above the modern village of the same name, in the province of Chota. 9 monumental structures of carved and polished stone constitute the visible core of the site. The stone itself is worked to a precision that requires planning, coordination, and specialized labor, none of which is compatible with the older model of this region as a peripheral zone. The 3 main platforms are arranged around a sunken plaza whose construction alone would have demanded organized effort over years, possibly decades. The site was first visited by Peruvian archaeologist Julio César Tello in the 1930s. A large carved stela with anthropomorphic figures found here was eventually transported to Lima and is currently on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. What remained at the site, buried, intact, and largely undisturbed, would wait another half-century for systematic excavation. The first radiocarbon dates from the Seiki Morales project established a 2-phase occupation, Pakapampa I, running from approximately 1200 to 800 BCE, and Pakapampa II, from approximately 800 to 500 BCE. The architecture visible on the surface belongs mostly to the later phase. But the burials the team began finding in the deeper layers pointed to something forming much earlier, and something for which the existing models of Andean social development had no ready explanation. Those 20 Strombus shells were not decoration. They were not surplus goods buried by chance. They were the floor of a tomb, arranged with intention, covered in pigment, and placed there by people who understood that where you lay your dead says everything about what you believe they were worth. The individual placed on those shells was not just a person. He was an argument. And Pakapampa, it was becoming clear, had been making that argument for a very long time. The question of when social hierarchy began in the Andes is not philosophical. It has a material answer, and for most of the 20th century, that answer pointed to Chavín de Huántar, a ceremonial center in the Ancash Highlands, active around 900 BCE. Chavín was the template, its carved stone iconography, its network of influence stretching hundreds of kilometers across Andean territory, its system of controlled access and deliberate architectural power. If you wanted to understand how authority was organized in ancient Peru, you began there. Pakapampa was always in that story, but as a receiver, not a source. Its carved stone motifs, feline figures, serpent imagery, supernatural hybrid forms, resembled Chavín's vocabulary closely enough that the prevailing interpretation treated Pakapampa as a participant in the Chavín network rather than a center developing its own logic. That assumption held for decades, largely because no one had excavated deep enough at Pakapampa to find out what was happening there before the Chavín period arrived, or whether the direction of influence was what the model assumed. Diana Alemán, a Peruvian archaeologist and member of the project team, works primarily with the architectural stratigraphy, the superimposed floors, the fill sequences, the way platforms were rebuilt on top of earlier platforms across 7 centuries of continuous construction. What those layers show is a site actively inventing and refining its own ceremonial logic across generations, not reproducing a template received from elsewhere. You cannot rebuild a ceremonial platform correctly across 7 centuries without institutional memory. You cannot maintain the orientation of a sacred space without a mechanism for transmitting that knowledge. The architecture itself is evidence of hierarchy, not just stone on stone, but social continuity of people who understood what the space meant and why it had to be maintained in a specific way. Then, in October 2009, a boot-shaped shaft tomb appeared on the 3rd platform, in the forecourt directly in front of the main temple building, at a depth placing it in the earlier layers of Pakapampa II, around 750 BCE. Inside was a woman between 30 and 40 years old. Skeletal analysis conducted in Japan showed her estimated stature was approximately 15 centimeters taller than the contemporary female population at Pakapampa and 20 to 25 centimeters above females at other formative period sites in the region. She had been eating differently from everyone else around her from an early age. Dental analysis confirmed lower rates of caries than the non-elite population. Not a lucky year, but a life organized around systematically different access to food from its beginning. Her skull had been deliberately reshaped. Beginning shortly after birth and continuing until approximately age 3, wooden splints had been bound to her head, producing a fronto-occipital deformation unprecedented in any other burial at Pakapampa. Someone decided, before she could speak or walk, that she would carry a permanent visible mark. The deformation did not make her powerful. It announced, from infancy, that she already was. She was buried with 2 gold earrings approximately 25 centimeters long, a necklace of mollusk shell beads, an anklet on her right foot, and 4 ceramic vessels placed above where her body lay. Among them a pedestal dish with holes designed to maintain combustion, with traces of charcoal and ash indicating a ritual performed at the exact moment of burial. A small object of chrysocolla, a rare green mineral, had been placed inside her mouth. Over her skull, red cinnabar sourced from Huancavelica, over 850 kilometers to the south, and blue azurite powder. The same combination of pigments would reappear in every high-status burial found at Pakapampa in the decades that followed, as though the color itself was the protocol, belonging not to any individual life, but to the institution of power itself. She had been placed in the ground before the main temple above her was built. The temple was constructed on top of her tomb, not by coincidence, but by design. The people who climbed that platform and stood before the main temple were standing above a burial that made a claim about what this place was and who had made it legitimate. That is not peripheral. That is not derivative. That is a society that already knew 3,000 years ago exactly what it was doing with power and exactly how to make it last. By 2015, The Pakapampa archaeological project had been running for 10 years and had produced one extraordinary burial. One was enough to shift how researchers thought about the site. Two would begin to shift how they thought about the entire formative period in the northern Andes. The second tomb appeared in the northern platform, a shaft structure, like the first, but with a difference that made it immediately unusual. It contained two individuals, positioned one on top of the other, each placed on their side in a flexed position with their heads facing one another, one oriented toward the north, the other toward the south. The arrangement was deliberate. The two individuals had been placed in a relationship to each other that the people preparing the burial considered meaningful, a pairing that extended beyond life into the structure of the tomb itself. Juan Pablo Villanueva, Peruvian archaeologist and co-director of the project's field operations, oversaw the documentation of what the tomb contained. The upper individual was an adult female. She had been placed holding a ceramic vessel directly over her torso, a black bottle in the form of a serpent with a jaguar's head, the hybrid figure that gives the tomb its name. Beneath her lay a younger male, considered the primary interment based on the objects associated specifically with him, a gold net made of hollow ovoid beads, each one engraved with a figure-of-8 design, with a single elongated oval pendant at its center weighing approximately 7 grams. In front of his skull, powdered mineral pigments had been carefully arranged: red cinnabar, green malachite, dark brown hematite, glossy black magnetite, white calcite, blue azurite. 6 distinct mineral colors, each one sourced, ground, and placed with precision. The meaning of that specific combination has not been determined. What is certain is that it was not accidental, and that the same red and blue pairing of cinnabar and azurite connects this burial directly to the Lady of Pakapampa found 6 years earlier. The gold necklace is one of the oldest examples of worked gold recovered anywhere in the Americas. That fact deserves a moment. Not gold found as raw material, not gold in unmodified form, gold that had been worked, shaped into hollow beads, engraved with a repeated geometric motif, assembled into a chain with a central pendant, by someone at Pakapampa or within Pakapampa's exchange network, sometime around 700 BCE. The technology required to produce hollow gold beads of that consistency implies specialized knowledge, dedicated time, and access to a supply of raw material that did not come from the immediate highlands of Cajamarca. The necklace did not appear from nowhere. It was produced within a social system capable of supporting specialized craft production, which is itself evidence of hierarchy, of a surplus that allowed certain people to spend their time making objects that others would wear. The tomb sat near a large plaza enclosed by walls of sculpted stone, accessed by 2 staircases. The staircases matter. A plaza with controlled entry points is not a public space in the ordinary sense. It is a space where access is managed, where the act of entering requires passing through a defined threshold, under conditions set by whoever controls that threshold. The architecture of the northern platform was designed to organize movement, to concentrate people in specific places and restrict them from others. That kind of spatial control is not incidental to power. It is one of its primary mechanisms. Taken together, the 2 burials from 2009 and 2015 established a pattern at Pakapampa that raised a question the existing model of Andean social development struggled to answer cleanly. Both tombs dated to Phase 2, roughly 700 to 600 BCE, contemporary with, or slightly earlier than, the peak of Chavín de Huántar's influence across the northern highlands. The conventional picture placed the emergence of priestly elites in the Andes within the Chavín horizon, as what Pakapampa has produced across 20 years of excavation is not a single extraordinary discovery. It is a sequence, and sequences, in archaeology, carry a different weight than isolated finds. A single remarkable tomb can be explained as an anomaly. 4 remarkable tombs, each one separated from the others by decades of continuous construction and ceremonial use, each one following a recognizable protocol of pigment and imported material and careful spatial placement, constitute something else. They constitute evidence of an institution. Masato Sakai, a Japanese archaeologist at Yamagata University and a core member of the Pakapampa project since its founding, has focused much of his analytical work on what the architectural sequence reveals about institutional continuity at the site. The platforms were not built once. They were built, used, partially dismantled, rebuilt at a greater height, and used again, in a cycle that repeated across the full 7 centuries of Pakapampa's occupation. Each rebuilding episode required the same orientation, the same spatial relationships between platform and plaza and staircase, the same logic of controlled access maintained across generations. That kind of continuity does not happen spontaneously. It requires that someone, in each generation, knew what the space was for and why it had to be maintained in a specific form. It requires transmission of knowledge, of authority, of the right to make decisions about what this place meant. The burials document the people at the center of that transmission. The priest of the Pitutus, placed on 20 Stromba shells from Ecuador sometime around 1200 BCE, in the earliest layers of Phase 1, before the main temple above him was fully realized, before the Lady of Pakapampa was interred on the 3rd platform, before the serpent jaguar priests were laid face to face in the northern platform. Then the lady, around 750 BCE, her skull shaped from infancy to signal a category that required permanent visible identification, buried beneath the axis of the main temple that would be constructed on top of her. Then the 2 serpent jaguar priests around 700 to 600 BCE, one holding the hybrid ceramic figure, the other wearing the oldest worked gold in the Americas, 6 mineral pigments arranged in front of his skull in a combination that echoes the lady's burial 4 generations earlier. Then the 2023 priest, circular tomb 3 meters wide, 6 layers of ash and earth sealing the offerings, ceramic bowls, a carved bone spatula, 2 seals, one bearing an anthropomorphic face and one a jaguar. The jaguar appearing again, as it appears in the ceramic vessel of the serpent jaguar tomb, as it appears in the carved stone iconography across Pakapampa's platforms. A presence so consistent across centuries that it functions less like a symbol and more like a signature. Each burial follows the same underlying logic: rare materials from distant places, specific colors applied to specific locations on the body, spatial placement within the ceremonial architecture that makes the burial itself part of the architecture. None of this was improvised. None of it was invented fresh for each individual. It was reproduced, which means it was remembered, transmitted, and enforced by people who understood that the protocol was the point, that the consistency of the ritual across generations was itself a claim about continuity of authority. That is the question Pakapampa has placed in front of Andean archaeology and not yet fully answered. Not whether hierarchy existed here. The burials settle that beyond reasonable dispute. The open question is how it began. The Phase 1 evidence is thin. Few tombs from the earliest occupation have been found, leaving the period between 1200 and 800 BCE archaeologically underrepresented. The priest of the Pitutus, the earliest of the confirmed elite burials, already shows the full protocol. Stromba shells from 500 kilometers away, cinnabar pigment, deliberate spatial placement. He is not the beginning of the system. He is evidence that the system already existed when he was interred. Whatever came before him, whatever the first generation of people at Pakapampa did to establish the logic that his burial reproduces, has not yet been found. The site today remains largely unexcavated. The 9 monumental structures visible on the surface represent the final phase of a 7th-century construction sequence, and what lies beneath them. The earlier platforms, the Phase 1 deposits, the burials that predate the lady and the priest of the Pitutus, is still in the ground. The Pakapampa Archaeological Project continues its work each season, and each season the sequence grows longer and the model of a single Chavan-centered origin for Andean hierarchy becomes harder to sustain. What Pakapampa documents is not a peripheral site receiving influence from a dominant center. It is a center that was building its own version of power, in stone, in gold, in the colors of distant minerals pressed against the faces of its dead, for 700 years, and doing it in a way specific enough to leave a record and open enough to leave questions that a century of archaeology has not yet closed. Part of a broader religious and political system radiating outward from Chavan's monumental core. But Pakapampa was not receiving that system. It was generating its own version of it, with its own iconographic vocabulary, its own burial protocols, its own network of long-distance exchange reaching Ecuador, the southern highlands, and wherever the gold and the chrysocolla came from. "We have to correct our idea," Yuji Seki told reporters after the 2023 discovery, because already then, powerful leaders appeared in the Andes. The correction was not modest. It pointed toward a formative period that was not organized around a single dominant center, but around multiple nodes of authority developing simultaneously, each one building its own ceremonial infrastructure, its own system of marking elite status, its own way of translating power into the permanent language of stone and gold and imported pigment. What Pakapampa was doing, burial by burial, platform by platform, was constructing an argument, not in words. The site has produced no writing system, no inscription that decodes its intentions directly. The argument was made in the arrangement of space, in the specific objects chosen to accompany the dead, in the colors placed against bone, in the direction a body faced, in the distance a shell had traveled to serve as the floor of a grave. Every decision in those tombs was a statement about what this place was, who belonged at its center, and what it meant to hold authority in the northern Andes 3,000 years ago.